Thank you all very much. We won't take a great deal of your time, and I'm certainly not going to be speaking for a huge amount of time, but I just thought I'd give a rough idea of what the hell this book's about, because there are so many books. I was brought up on these sorts of books on humanism. Humanism as a Philosophy by Corliss Lamont, but this one, a little-known book by an American moralist, Edward Howard Griggs, a much more sort of Christian type of humanism. This came out in 1899. Then there's... Now this is a fabulous book. Oh, hello.
Hello.
This came out in 1926, Scientific Humanism, by Lothrop Stoddard. Let me give you an idea of some of the other titles that this person is responsible for. The Rising Tide of Colour Against White World Conspiracy.
Great.
All right. So this guy is still, you can still find him on white supremacist websites, and yet this is the first book with the title Scientific Humanism, to my knowledge. So there's more to humanism than meets the eye, and not all of it's good. And what I've tried to do in this book is show the good and the bad. A lot of
the
them,
ugly.
well, there's enough of that as well, but that's more autobiographical. And then there's the reasonably sort of boring ones like this, which was workmanlike and sort of interesting. I should get a medal for some of the things I've read for this book. Then there's postmodernist variations on humanism, like this. But what's most exciting, and what I've tried to do in this book, is the stuff that you can't find here. This book, for instance, was on the attempt... This was a conference in Cairo in 1984 on Muslim people trying to look toward a humanism based on the philosopher Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and to talk about the Muslim idea of ijtihad, in other words, strenuous endeavour. So it's not anti-God, their humanism. This is a Muslim humanism, trying to make Islam rational and friendly toward research. That's exciting.
Got a big job there, I think.
There's a bit of a job ahead, but there are people doing it.
Yeah,
you know, Boutros Ghali, the then Secretary General of the UN, hosted this conference. There are other exciting things, like these I found in India. Humanist Values, a source book. You never find these sorts of books in New Zealand. This is another book I found from India. Philosophical Humanism in Contemporary India, looking at the philosophical roots of Indian thought. So in the chapter, the book is not just about European humanism. There's a chapter about Indian humanism, where all this comes in. There's the chapter on humanism in the Middle East, where I discuss what's happening here. There's a chapter on humanism in China, where I also discuss humanistic Buddhism. As you may know, the big Buddhist temple down in South Auckland, the Fo Guan Shan, is a branch of Buddhism that talks about humanistic Buddhism. So why not discuss humanism that it has all of these things mentioned in it? Then you've got people like Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian mystic. If I do one quote from the book, it'll be from him. He was a great discovery. And then in Africa, African humanism. This is probably the only copy of this in the country. I picked this up in a conference in South Korea from the bloke who wrote it, Mugobe Ramose. African philosophy through Ubuntu. This brilliant idea of the Africans, Ubuntu, which is, it's a very humanistic idea, but it's one that Christians have been using as well, about finding yourself not just through serving others, but finding yourself in working with others. There's a slight difference, but it's a thoroughly humanistic account. And one of the African philosophers has described Ubuntu as Africa's gift to the 21st century. So I do quite a lot of talk about Ubuntu in the chapter on African humanism. In the chapter on Christian humanism, I mention, somewhat disparagingly, I'll have to say, Jacques Maritain, his Catholic idea of humanism, which of course is true humanism, and anything else is false.
Thomistic too, I presume.
Quite so. And then you have the more recent Christian humanism from English religious radicals, of which you see variations on the theme here in New Zealand with Lloyd Gearing and so on. And in the European existentialism and humanism. So what I've tried to do with this book is to bring all of this, and this is just a sample of them, all of this sort of thing together to give an historical account of humanism. Everybody says their book fills a gap. Everybody says that, and it's all untrue, except when I say it. Because there's not actually been a history of humanism. There really hasn't been, let alone one that covers humanism in Africa, in the Middle East, in China, in India, among Christian thinkers, among Muslim thinkers, as well as in the secular West. So that's what I'm trying to do. And just a couple of quotations. One of the ones I liked the most came from the people who wouldn't normally have called themselves humanists. Albert Schweitzer was one of the ones who I was most impressed with. He was asked about humanism in 1951, and he says, "The world thinks it must raise itself above humanism, that it must look for a more profound spirituality, but it's taken a false road. Humanism, in all its simplicity, is the only genuine spirituality. Only ethics and religion, which include in themselves the humanitarian ideal, have true value." So he's praising humanism in the way that he lived it in his life, because as you know, Schweitzer was out there in Africa doing serious work, but he was thinking as much of as a humanist as a Christian. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is suggest that we don't want always to think in terms of clear boundaries between one and the other here anyway. The other person who impressed me most, really, and about whom I knew very little before I started this book, was Rabindranath Tagore. Now, his book doesn't really read well. The title of his book, The Religion of Man, that's not going to work in the 21st century, but that doesn't mean that this is not a very beautiful book. He says, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms toward perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by you into an ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, let my country awake." What this book is about. I'm trying to write a general history of humanism. Just the last quote from the introduction. I say that this is it's a work of synthesis, and I've refrained from tidying up messy edges or ensuring a clean but misleading continuity. Many people have observed that humanism is a movable feast, and this book shall certainly provide evidence of that. For many, the vagueness of humanism, the fact that it does appeal across so many cultures, counts against it. But it's just possible that, in the 21st century, this could be its greatest asset. So that's what I'm trying to show, how the very vagueness of it, the very appeal it has across people of all different cultures and backgrounds, may not be its weakness, it may be its strength. Right? So anyway, thank you all very much for coming. Nobody is under an obligation to buy this book, but thank you for being here.